The morning Lachlan Drummond stood at the center of Meridian Composites' main fabrication bay and announced in front of 230 people that Portia Acheampong was being relieved of her operational role. He did it with a wireless microphone he had not needed to bring, but had brought anyway, and his voice reached every corner of the building, including the far end of Bay C, where a prototype panel that had cost the company 8 months of work was still curing in its rack, waiting for the only person who knew how to tell if it was truly ready. He had called the all-staff meeting the previous evening, late enough that the calendar invites arrived after most people had left for the day. By 8:30 on a gray Tuesday in March, the room was full. Lachlan arrived in a charcoal blazer with no notes, which was the tell. The people who had worked at Meridian long enough to know him understood that when he arrived without notes, he had been rehearsing. He spoke for 11 minutes. He talked about scale. He talked about the transition from what he called founder mythology to institutional rigor. He said the word instinct, the way some people say superstition, with a faint, barely visible tightening around the mouth that suggested the concept itself embarrassed him. And then he gestured toward the 15 engineers he had arranged in a row behind him. From Waterloo, from McGill, from MIT, from Delft, and he presented them the way someone unveils a renovation. Here is what I have replaced the old thing with, and isn't it better? Portia was standing near the back, close to the equipment, the way she always stood at company meetings. She was wearing a gray fleece and a collared shirt, and her hair was pulled back the way it was on days she planned to spend on the floor. She was 47 years old, and she had built Meridian Composites from a government microgrant, a maxed-out line of credit, and a second-hand autoclave she had repaired herself before it ever processed a single panel. The building they were standing in had been a leaking warehouse when she signed the lease. The company now held contracts with 3 major aerospace manufacturers and had been valued, the previous fiscal year, at just under $2 billion. None of that appeared in the 11 minutes Lachlan spoke. She did not raise her hand. She did not challenge him in front of the room. She watched him with an expression that several people nearby would later struggle to describe. Not anger, not surprise. Something closer to the look of someone who has already, quietly, calculated where a structure will fail long before the first crack becomes visible to anyone else. When the microphone was put away, and the 15 engineers began introducing themselves to one another, Portia moved through the crowd without hurry, stopping at a few workstations to speak in low voices to the technicians who had been with her since the early years. She handed her access badge and office key to the operations manager with a small nod of thanks. She paused at the entrance to Bay C, long enough to tell a young composite technician named Wes to watch panel 7 in the 3rd curing rack carefully. The resin mix had been running 3 degrees warm all week, and nobody had adjusted the layup schedule to compensate. And it would matter whether anyone believed her or not. She said it the way she said most things, quietly, without performance. Then she walked out through the side entrance, and the door closed behind her, and the building felt different in a way that had nothing to do with temperature or airflow. Lachlan Drummond was 32 years old and had arrived at Meridian 10 months earlier on the recommendation of a board that had grown restless with what they described as Portia's resistance to institutional scaling. He held an MBA from Harvard and an undergraduate degree in materials engineering from Queens. And before Meridian, he had spent 5 years at a management consultancy, where he had turned around 3 mid-sized manufacturers by replacing process intuition with data-driven frameworks. He believed in this approach with the clean, unexamined certainty of someone who had not yet encountered a problem his methods could not eventually solve. His office on the top level of the building had a glass wall overlooking the fabrication floor, and he spent most of his hours behind it, reading dashboards and annotating slide decks, measuring the factory below in the language of throughput and variance, and optimized cycle time. He had reviewed Portia's personnel file during his first weeks in the role and found it remarkable in the numbers, and, ultimately, beside the point. The growth record was extraordinary, but the methods behind it were undocumented, unrepeatable, and dependent on a single person, which was, in his assessment, exactly the kind of operational fragility a serious manufacturer could not afford to carry. He had written the word redundant in a margin, and then crossed it out. He had closed the file and moved on to building the team he believed would systematize what she had, until then, simply embodied. The 15 engineers he retained were accomplished in ways that could be verified. 2 held doctoral theses in composite fatigue analysis. 1 had worked on structural panels for a European space program. 3 had come from aerospace primes where they had managed certification cycles for commercial aircraft components. They arrived at Meridian on a Monday, were given full facility access by Wednesday, and within 10 days were ready to take ownership of the project Portia had spent 8 months developing. A prototype composite structural frame for a new regional aircraft platform. A contract that, if certified, would be the largest in Meridian's history. The prototype was 90% complete when they took over. All that remained was the final lamination sequence, the autoclave cycle, and certification. They ran it through in 4 days. The panel delaminated at the secondary bond line. Under a load, it should have cleared by 30%. They recalibrated, re-ran the cure cycle with tighter temperature tolerances, and failed again. They replaced the resin batch, adjusted the vacuum bagging sequence, ran it a 3rd time. The ultrasonic inspection came back clean. The load cell readings looked perfect until the panel gave way with a sound like a rifle crack inside the test frame. The most methodical of the 15. A patient, precise engineer from Delft who had rarely met a problem that didn't yield to thorough iteration, request access to 3 years of procurement records. He cross-referenced fiber lot numbers, resin viscosity reports, cure kinetics data from every panel in recent history. Everything was within specification. Every instrument said the part should work. No instrument explained why it kept failing. Lachlan watched from behind the glass and felt the first genuine unease he had experienced since arriving at Meridian. He sent requests for progress updates through his assistant every few hours. The summaries that came back grew shorter and more technical, and less conclusive with each passing day. Late on a Thursday evening, he called a board member, Elaine Forsyth, who had backed Meridian since its 3rd year of operation, and she asked him, without softening it, whether the stories circulating in the industry were accurate, whether a team of 15 specialists genuinely could not complete a prototype that a single woman had been certifying successfully, alone, for 17 years. He told her they were close to a solution. His hand was slightly unsteady when he put the phone down. He began walking the fabrication floor in person for the first time in months. He moved between the curing racks and workstations and watched the 15 engineers bent over laptops and printouts with the particular exhaustion of people who had stopped sleeping well, who were beginning, privately, to suspect that whatever they were looking for existed somewhere outside the boundaries of what their training had prepared them to find. The stakes attached to this prototype were not abstract. The aerospace prime waiting on certification had a delivery window that could not move. 2 competing suppliers were already in preliminary conversations about backup arrangements. If Meridian failed, the contract would go elsewhere, and the reputation for precision that Portia had built carefully over 19 years would take a wound it might not recover from quickly. It was Hugh Carmichael who eventually asked the question that changed the direction of everything. Hugh was 62, gray at the temples, the kind of man who said little in meetings and was always the last one out at the end of a shift. He had been at Meridian for 15 years and had worked alongside Portia on 11 prototype programs. He had spent 3 evenings in the building's records room. After the 15 engineers had gone home, working through the physical certification binders that lined the back shelves, the engineers had glanced at them and set them aside in favor of the digital system, which was faster and more searchable, and, it turned out, significantly less complete. What the binders held was a handwritten record no digital transfer had captured. Every successful prototype certification, going back to Meridian's fourth year, carried a final verification signature at the very bottom of the sign-off sheet, beneath the lead engineer's approval, beneath the quality manager's initials, beneath the external auditor's stamp. It appeared in a column labeled Final Readiness Confirmation, a field that existed in no current digital form, because no one had thought to include it when the records were migrated. The signature was always the same, written in the same small, even hand. Portia Acheampong, not listed as program manager or approval authority, simply present in that column on every single sheet. Hugh counted 43 successful certifications across 17 years. 43. Her signature on every one, and no one else's in that field. He requested access to the archived security footage next. He spent a full day in a dim viewing room, scrolling through recordings that were grainy in the early years and sharper in the later ones. And in clip after clip, he watched the same sequence repeat with the consistency of something that had become, over time, a form of ritual. Portia would approach a finished panel before any certification run. She would press her palm flat against the surface and hold it there, completely still, eyes closed. Then she would begin tapping, knuckle against composite, light and deliberate, moving across the face of the panel in a slow grid, pausing in certain spots, returning to others, her head tilted at an angle that made her look as though she were listening to something the room itself could not quite pick up. And then, almost every time, she would reach for a single instrument, a hand roller, a feeler gauge, sometimes only her thumb pressed firmly against a specific seam, and make one small adjustment. The adjustments were barely visible on camera, but after each one, across 17 years of footage, the certification run that followed was clean. In 15 years of standing in the same building as that woman, Hugh had never once thought to ask her what she was hearing. He brought the binders and the tablet to Lachlan's office and laid them open on the desk without much preamble. He let the footage speak the way Portia herself usually did. Lachlan watched 2 clips twice, his expression moving through stages Hugh hadn't seen on him before. Confusion, then a slow, uncomfortable recognition, then something that sat at the uneasy edge of embarrassment. He asked Hugh where she was now. Human Resources spent 2 days finding a current contact, and in the end, the answer came not from any file but from Danny Tremblay, a materials handler who had been at Meridian since its second year, and mentioned, without being asked, that he had run into her the previous weekend at a community makerspace in Scarborough. She had been teaching a group of teenagers to build a small composite drone frame from offcuts she had brought herself, showing a 15-year-old how to read the surface of a panel before trusting any instrument's verdict on it. Lachlan drove there himself. No assistant, no briefing notes, no talking points prepared in advance. He parked on a side street outside a storefront with a hand-lettered sign and the cluttered, purposeful energy of a place where things were actually being built. Through the window, he could see workbenches and safety glasses, and young people bent over projects with expressions of concentrated effort. Portia was at the far end of the room, guiding someone's hands toward a surface with the patience of a person who has spent a lifetime teaching without calling it that. She looked up when she heard the door and did not appear surprised to see him. She set down what she was holding, said something quietly to the person beside her, and walked toward him with the unhurried steadiness that seemed to be simply how she moved through the world. He told her the situation plainly. 3 failed certification runs. The contract at serious risk. The board had made clear that a 4th failure would carry consequences well beyond a single prototype. He said the company needed her back. She listened to all of it without interrupting, and then she shook her head and said no. He asked her, after a pause, why she had never challenged the dismissal. She was a founder, a billionaire by any honest measure. She could have gone to the press, to the board, to any number of people who would have listened. She had said nothing. She was quiet for a moment, deciding. Then she told him about something that had happened 23 years earlier, before Meridian existed, when she was a junior technician at a fabrication shop in Brampton. She had spent 14 months developing a surface pre-treatment process for a bonded assembly that kept failing at the same interface. Working on it, after her regular hours, on weekends, on her own time because she could not stand to leave a problem alone that she believed she could solve. She had eventually found it. A specific atmospheric conditioning sequence, run in a particular order, under humidity conditions within a 2-point window. It eliminated the interface failure entirely. The shop had not lost that bond line since. A program manager at the time, 10 years her senior, someone who had watched her develop the process without comment, had presented it to the parent company's engineering leadership at a quarterly review as his own breakthrough. He received a bonus and a promotion. Portia received a note slid under her locker door. The note said good work and had a smiley face drawn beside it in blue marker. She had not filed a complaint then either. Lachlan was quiet for a moment that felt longer than it was. She told him something else. Then, something that had never appeared in any company record. Her father had run a small auto body repair shop in Scarborough for 31 years. He had come to Canada from Ghana with a technical certificate, $50, and a capacity for work that most people could not sustain. He held no formal engineering credentials, but he could diagnose a failing suspension component from the driveway, before a car had fully stopped, simply by the way the vehicle moved over the last 10 meters of approach. The particular shimmy, the loaded hesitation that told him where the wear was before he ever put it on the hoist. Portia had grown up sitting on an overturned milk crate in the corner of that shop watching him, learning a way of knowing that was built not from textbooks but from attention, from the kind of patient, repetitive observation that produces certainty without being able to fully explain itself, because the explanation lives in the body rather than on any page. She had spent years at Meridian believing that kind of knowledge was ordinary, something every technician eventually developed with enough time on the floor, until she understood that it was in fact rare in the way that genuinely useful things always are. Lachlan came back 2 more times over the following days. Each visit was a little less formal than the last. He stopped arriving with a prepared position. On the second visit, he brought the personnel files of 12 current technicians and asked her, directly, which of them showed the kind of attention she had described, who was worth developing. She was quiet at the question for a moment, and then she was more specific in her answer than he had expected. She agreed, eventually, to return. Her condition had nothing to do with money or title. She asked only that Meridian establish a formal mentorship structure in which every certified engineer on staff would spend a minimum of 6 months working alongside a senior technician before assuming independent authority over any fabrication decision. Credential and experience, she said simply, should have to earn each other's trust before either one was handed unchecked authority over a finished part. He agreed without negotiating. When Portia walked back through Meridian's side entrance, 3 days later, word had already moved through the building in the way that news travels, in places where people actually care about what happens. Not through announcements, but through the quiet, lateral current of information passing between people who trust one another. By the time she reached Bay C, a loose ring of technicians and engineers had gathered near the entrance. Not close enough to crowd her, close enough to watch. She said nothing to any of them. She walked directly to the prototype. Panel 7, the one she had told Wes to watch on her way out, and began the way she always began. She circled the panel once, eyes moving across every surface. She laid her palm flat against the bond line and held it there. Then she started tapping, knuckle to composite, moving in slow, deliberate rows across the face of the panel, head tilted at the angle the security cameras had recorded dozens of times without anyone upstairs ever thinking to ask what it meant. The room was completely still. She stopped at a point roughly 20 centimeters from the left edge of the lower secondary bond line. She tapped it twice, more, a resonance slightly duller than the surrounding material, a difference so small it fell, well within the tolerance band, the NDT equipment had been calibrated to ignore. She called for a feeler gauge and measured a gap in the seam that no system had flagged because it sat 0.03 of a millimeter below the minimum detectable defect threshold. Alone, in isolation, the gap should not have been enough to cause the failures they had seen. But Portia knew, from 17 years of listening to panels describe themselves honestly, that at this exact location, given the load path of the frame and the fiber orientation in the adjacent plies, that gap was functioning as a stress concentrator. Every load test had initiated a microfracture at that point, propagating along the bond line in a direction no simulation had modeled because no simulation had placed a defect there. She called for a hand roller and spent 4 minutes working the area with steady, careful pressure. Then she specified a modified dwell profile for a localized recure cycle, from memory, without consulting a manual, and stepped back. 2 hours later, the recured panel went into the test frame. The load cell climbed past specification without hesitation, held at limit load for the full dwell period, and returned clean. The sound that moved through the room was not a cheer. It was quieter than that, and more complicated. The specific exhale of people processing something they had watched happen in front of them, but were still, in some private part of themselves, working to fully accept. Lachlan stood at the bay entrance, and did not move toward the panel, and did not reach for his phone. He stood with his hands at his sides, and felt, for the first time since arriving at Meridian, the particular smallness of a person standing at the actual distance between what they believed they understood and what they actually did. He called an all-staff meeting for the following morning. He stood on the same platform where he had made his announcement 3 weeks earlier. This time there was no microphone and no notes and no row of credentialed engineers behind him. He told the room that he had looked at a record of results spanning 17 years and failed to ask a single question about how those results had been produced, that he had mistaken the legibility of expertise for its actual depth, that he had come into the building believing he was modernizing something that needed modernizing, and had instead very nearly destroyed something that had taken 2 decades to build. He said all of it without the qualifying language that allows a person to technically admit fault while cushioning the essential comfort of their own position. He did not soften it and did not spin it. He told them the company had come close to losing something irreplaceable, and that this was his fault, and that he intended to use whatever time he had left at Meridian, making sure the systems he built actually reflected what he had learned in the past 3 weeks. Several longtime employees exchanged glances of the quiet, wide-eyed kind that appear when an executive says something unambiguously honest in public without apparent motive. The 15 engineers did not retreat. In the weeks that followed, they came to Portia, one by one, with notebooks. They asked about the tapping method, about what she was listening for, about how the resonance of a healthy bond differed from one developing a void. Hugh Carmichael's mentorship log shows 11 meeting requests in the first month alone. 2 of the engineers began developing a formal acoustic signature protocol, an attempt to translate into transferable language what Portia had always known through touch. It was imperfect, and she told them so plainly, and they accepted it without argument. Closer than nothing, she said, was where all real knowledge started. The certification demonstration took place 6 weeks later. The panel cleared the test protocol on its first attempt. The contract was signed 4 days after that. Portia stood near the back of the room during the signing. She had accepted a formal title, Director of Fabrication Integrity. Not because the title meant anything particular to her personally, but because it had arrived as a petition signed by every technician and engineer in the building. That was different from anything a board resolution could produce. She still wore the same gray fleece on most days. She still arrived before most of the building. She still stopped at each new hire's workstation during their first weeks and showed them, unhurried and without ceremony, the specific way she pressed her palm against composite and waited, really waited, for what the surface was trying to say before she let any instrument have the final word. One evening, long after the visitors had gone and the fabrication floor had emptied out, Lachlan found her in Bay C, running a check on a new panel. The check was unnecessary. She was doing it out of habit, out of the simple fact that caring about the work does not switch off when the contract is signed. He asked her what she was actually hearing when she laid her hands against composite that way. What the surface told her that the instruments were not designed to find. She held the panel for a moment before she answered. Then she said that a material, like a person, will always tell you the truth about itself, but only if you are willing to arrive without conclusions already prepared, and simply listen for what it is actually saying, rather than what you came expecting to hear. Lachlan thought about that for a long time afterward. He thought of it when dashboards showed clean numbers for projects that later developed problems no one had looked closely enough to catch. He thought of it when the room spoke confidently about things they had not personally touched. And sometimes, on the mornings he now spent walking the fabrication floor rather than watching it from above, he thought of it while watching Portia move between the curing racks with her palm resting against whatever panel was closest, steady and unhurried, listening the way her father had taught her without ever calling it a lesson. In the quiet of the building before the day began,